Facaria will be starting in about a minute or so. There might have been some confusion because I think in the website, I was thinking it was hybrid, wherein it will be simultaneously broadcasted in the Teams and at the same time here in the MPH. And I'm aware that some people told me that they will be attending for the online session, not the face-to-face. So maybe that's the confusion. But the HR sent another reminder that this is an actual in-person webinar. Okay, shall we start? Okay, so I'm assuming that there will be no more people coming. So good morning, everybody, for those who are here. The topic for the seminar and slightly workshop is about visualizing risk, health, and safety in the laboratories and in the workshop. But before we proceed with this, let me tell you about the health and safety arrangement of the venue. So you will notice that one of the things that we usually emphasize is the evacuation route. There are no scheduled drill, or there are no scheduled maintenance here in the building. If there is an alarm bell ringing, then what we will be doing is we will try to confirm whether it is an actual emergency, and if there is a need to evacuate, the primary evacuation route would be to your left, to this exit door, and the assembly point would be towards the caravan up. However, if we are able to pass through the building during an evacuation, we will be going out of the door and into the corridors and into the main entrance of the APS-PH building. In front is the parking, and in front would be, adjacent to that would be the drop-off for the buses. In the context of our evacuation plan, it would be here in front and the assembly point. The bus parking is at this side. So this would be the evacuation from the MPH up to here. Welfare facilities, the toilets, more or less you are aware of that. So it will be downstairs to your left for both the female and the male toilet. So we go to the main topic. When we are talking about visualizing risk, health, and safety, we are basically talking about the 10% of the data being processed in our brain, whereas the 90% is those images that we already have within the brain. And basically, it's kind of a blank slate wherein we have this particular information, and then we are faced with that. We need to interpret that if we are facing such images or such information or experiences for the first time. As a disclaimer, because the HR or the admin is recording this, as much as possible, it's constituting a fair use of published copyrighted material. But take note that some of the content material contained within the presentation of this seminar are not limited to statements or images only, but may contain content, but I have not requested any permission or rights to those in content because of short time and short notice. However, within the fair use and applicable copyright laws, we are exempted for purposes of educational and training. So the purpose and objectives of this is because there's already precedence. And of course, when we talk about precedence, we are talking about the previous experiences that we have had. within the campus, within our workplaces, especially when we are working within the laboratories and the workshops. And of course, when we are talking about this, we need to identify the different risks or the hazards that we have. And of course, when we talk about identifying the hazards, what do we do about it if we identify these hazards? So we conduct some self-assessment and then integrate that in our action plans for the laboratories and the workshops so that we can more or less provide some control measures and disseminate this through awareness among all the staff or users for those laboratories and the workshops that we have in our respective departments and sections. So, as a general overview, we will be establishing the context of what we are talking about in terms of trying to imagine, in terms of trying to visualize RHS or risk, health, and safety. And slightly, because of time limitation, put it into context or put it into practice. I'm going to be giving you some papers for that, and we will be answering it. We don't have the time to do an actual laboratory ocular inspection for this particular activity. What is the basis for this? So the basis of health and safety and risk management in the campus is basically governed by all the external factors that are surrounding more or less the different laws, regulations, protocols, guidance, and similar documents that we have and being applied here in the country. So you have the national context of the health and safety system, and then you have the ministerial decree. For example, you have the decree 114 year 2001 pertaining to the conservation of the environment and prevention of pollution as a main guideline. Then you also have a decree within the Oman Labor Law governing the safety and the health of the workers in general. We will not be literal about the term worker. We are talking about all the people that are working within different sectors or within different industries, because there are some people that connote the term worker differently. So if they are talking about a worker, they are talking about a laborer. It is not. We are all workers in the different industries or in the different sectors. So we are in the education or in the academic sector, so we are governed by that Oman labor law. And of course, you have the different colleges or departments, protocols or guidance that we are following based on the national system, based on the ministerial decree. As an example, I have already mentioned this and all the different regulations, the policies that we have. Outside the external one, we may be talking about the international standards that we are talking about from the International Labor Law, which more or less is the basis for the Oman Labor Law, for example, or the Center for Disease and Control and Prevention in the United States, the Health and Safety Executive in the United Kingdom, for example, the different professional bodies, for example, Risk and Safety Management, Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, this one in the United States and this one in the UK, providing international guidance or guidelines already. And then we also have, for example, the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association 101, which is the Life Safety Code, which is governing more or less the what occurs within the building. And I know that the ROP is more or less following the guidelines within here. So these things serves as a framework for us in the context of the basis for following or implementing risk, health, and safety. The other slide that I'm talking about, the system based on the previous slides, national, ministerial, the different guidance for the department or the colleges, and of course, how they are implemented in the workplace. So these are the basis for us, and primarily, though I was told during the workshop pertaining to strategic planning that it might change, but the basis for the UTAS campus is the two ministerial policies that we have on health and safety and risk management. For further details of those two policies, you can go to the QAD website and go to the policies, and you will see it there, risk management and health and safety policies. Because take note that when we talk about health and safety, it is intended to bring about the condition free from any risk of injury or threat to our overall health and well-being. Because of this, we are talking about this objective being not a natural state of affairs, meaning it is deliberate because it does not occur naturally within us. It more or less talks about we need to make an effort to implement or to follow the protocols governing health and safety. I know that most of us knows about this when we are asked, because we know the term risk, health, and safety, but when we are concretely asked what is safety, for example, we might be talking about the images, the implied connotation of what health or safety is all about. One of the things that is implied would be the different symbols that you see, would be the different colors that you see within your laboratory or within your workshop. For example, this particular symbol would talk about prohibition, meaning you are not allowed to do anything. Mandatory is the blue color, a circular signage, triangular, or anything that is yellow. You talk about what? A caution or a hazard, whereas the green is a safe condition. Anything that is red and related to all the different firefighting or fire safety connotes a red color also. This is only the symbol which is red, with a bar, diagonal bar across, which more or less talks about red. It is prohibited on your part from doing something within that particular workplace or work area. The other thing is when we talk about the different signages that you see or symbols that you see. For example, you have the cycle that is based on the ADRI model that we have, or we are talking about the different symbols that you see in your laboratories or in your workshop. So, when we talk about that, we try to explicitly say that health or safety in general is a condition of being protected from anything that may happen that is beyond your control within your particular workplace. And at the same time, when we talk about risk, we are talking about anything that could harm you or prevent or delay or enhance your ability to achieve your objectives, achieve your work in that particular workplace or in the laboratory or safety. The thing is, you have to balance out the control measures and the risk that you have. So, for example, if the balance is skewed to your right, it means that you have a high level of the risk or the hazards that you have in your workplaces. You have to balance that so that you are protecting your assets. When we are talking about assets, we are talking about either infrastructural, either the equipment or the material, and even the human resources that are working in those workplaces. So, if this continues, what could potentially happen in your workplace? So, most of the things that are being anecdotally informed or told to me is or are the near misses. So when we talked about near misses, is that it is basically an accident, but there was no harm being done because more or less the person involved escaped that particular incident. The classic example is that if you have a lot of things on the shelf and it is hanging below, beyond the boundary of your shelf, and it fell, and it so happened that you are beside it, but you are not harmed, it is a near miss. But if there is an injury on the part of the worker in that particular area, so it can be a minor or it can be a major injury that can result into death, then that is an accident already. So that is an unfortunate incident that has occurred, which more or less results in a minor or a major injury, which can also result to death. Both of these are incidents occurring within that particular workplace. So all of this, later on, we should be able to report this in our workplaces. So we believe that accidents, illness, and incidents are preventable provided that health and safety is managed. How do we do that? By more or less emphasizing on the workplace culture. So when we are talking about workplace culture, we are talking about all those attitudes or beliefs and behavior of our institution that make up the regular atmosphere in our workplace or in our work environment. What is the current attitude? What is the current belief or the current behavior that we have? So this is usually reflected in how we respond to the different situations that we encounter within our workplaces. So the success or failure may depend on what the culture that we have here. For example, the culture of implementation. Is it a positive or a negative thing within our institution? As simple as the no parking signages, the no parking painted on the streets within the campus. What is our culture of compliance? What is our culture of following? Are we following that or not? You can see for yourself outside the roads where there are no parking signages or there are painted signages about the no parking sign across the campus that we have. So by the way, those are not placed there just for the sake of having a no parking slot in those areas. Those are implemented or being implemented or enforced because there are significant reasons why those areas along the roads should be vacant. For example, the one near the engineering, we have a substation which is a fire hazard. Or the one opposite the old building beside the Triple E building is also a sensitive infrastructure because it is a main store for chemicals. It is also a fire hazard. So if you are talking about obstruction that are found in those areas, it means that if there is a fire, the fire truck cannot get in and cannot go near those areas, and it will be a problem for us. So these things, as simple as compliance or following the different instructions that we have, is a form of workplace culture already for us. So what does it say on the part of the workers? What does it say on the part of the administration? So who creates this, or what creates the workplace culture? So these are the different factors. Do we have the knowledge? Yes, do we have the visions and the values? Is it integrated in our strategic plan? Yes, especially for the upcoming or the modified strategic plan, these things are embedded or integrated there. What are our attitude? The engagement of all the stakeholders, including us, staff, and the students. How do we follow? How do we comply? How do we understand the things that are being implemented, the instructions that are being enforced or disseminated or cascaded to us via emails or instructions cascaded to us via the department council? And of course, is it properly communicated? The reality, there is a communication from the admin to the different departments. The departments via the department council, meaning composed of the HODs and the HOSs, should disseminate this information, if it's via email or decree, to the staff for that department. Are you regularly receiving those emails from your HOD or your HOSs? Because the problem might be, it is communicated, but is it communicated to us at the lowest level of the hierarchy, the staff in general? So, how are we communicated? The attitude of the people, us staff, and of course, the leadership. Is there a support system? Are we supported with what we are doing here? So it all boils down to all of these factors that creates the workplace culture. When we have all these positive or negative attitudes or negative connotations depending on the factors, then it influences our behavior. So the behavior now would determine whether we are complying, we are understanding, we are initiating, and we are doing on our own to maintain a risk-free and a positive health and safety culture within the workplace and the context of the laboratory and the workshop. Who are these people based on the factors that we have identified? It is basically everybody. So, from the top down or the bottom up. So we are talking about the admin, the management level, and all the different stakeholders that we have. Since we are talking about RHS, we are talking about the different coordinators of the different departments for RHS, the campus or the university committee, and of course, other appointed staff. In this case, we have the different responders, for example, for risk, health, and safety, and the other subgroups for the committee. And then, you have all the staff, whether they are laboratory or the teaching staff, the students, all the other staff with different roles being played out within the campus, and of course, the different visitors and the contractors. So it should be emphasized that all of us, more or less, have a particular role. Take note that it does not stop, especially for this, in the classroom, because we are aware that there are students or classes that are going out of the campus. So the field trip, the OJT, are also covered within the workplace culture and behavior and how we are following health and safety. How do we do that? We can do that by visualizing. So when we are talking about visualizing, it is the ability to find, understand, and evaluate what we imagine, the images, the shapes and designs that may affect us in our work. You notice that being able to see more would promote, meaning if we are able to see more of this visually, we are able to identify the different risks or the hazards and more or less promote a healthier and safer working environment. Initially, what I said before is that we are only making use of 10% visually of our brain. So, identifying any workplace hazard is generally complex, generally harder during the first time. That is why it is important, more or less, for you to imagine, for you to visualize what we are talking about. Because any word, any image can be interpreted differently by different individual. The term that may be used, for example, in the Philippines may have a different meaning in Oman, for example, or in other countries, for example. Or if you've heard one classic term, bottle, what comes to mind when we are talking about a bottle? Are we talking about what? An ordinary bottle or the typical bottle that you encounter in your day-to-day activity? So, what comes to mind? I will show you the next slide. Are these some of the images that you concur or you imagine in your mind? Or are we talking about one typical shape or the typical shape of a glass? So if we put out here the different images of what a bottle is, you will notice that some of you may not have encountered all of these things. You may have just visually imagined one type of bottle. But for the sake of information, there are different shapes of the bottle. There are different makes of the bottle. It can be a plastic, a glass, or aluminum. So all of these things would readily fire up your brains and imagine or picture what a bottle looks like. If I say again, what do you imagine if if I say the word pipette or pipette? What do you imagine if this pipette is being used by the mouth of the person? How do you imagine that? For those that are not yet aware of what a pipette or the pipette looks like, it is a cylindrical, just imagine a medicine dropper, for example, that you have in your medicine. Is it applicable to be used in the mouth or not? Just imagine that this medicine dropper is relatively long, like this long or longer than this. So, imagine that that pipette is being used in the laboratory, and I am saying that it is being used for sucking chemicals from the bottle. Is it acceptable? So, before the age of health and safety and standards and protocol, most people are using their mouth to suck hazardous chemical. But most of you, especially who have encountered a pipette in the laboratory, would not imagine that the medicine dropper is also a pipette or a pipette, which can be used, is acceptable for use for giving medicine to those who cannot easily swallow or who cannot or violently react to a teaspoon, or like the toddlers or the babies. So these are the things that we want to visually enhance when we talked about trying to imagine or visualize. The next set of slides are basically common. You have already encountered that maybe online because these are basically memes, famous memes already. So what do you see in the next two images that we have? So on the left, what do you see? On the right, what do you see? For this particular image, you might be seeing two things, right? Or are you seeing only one? It can be a picture of a vase, or it can be a picture of two faces facing each other. So, it is subject to the interpretation of each one of us. Then, the other one, you may see an old woman, or you may see a young woman in this particular image. Can you see that? Are you able to see the young and the old woman? Have you encountered this particular image? From afar, the old can be seen and the young woman can be seen. Anyone? Are you able to So, we will focus on the old woman. If you are from that particular perspective, the old woman is the one that I have surrounded by the rectangle. So, the lower part is the chin. And then the upper part of the chin, the line drawn here is the mouth. Then the upper part is the nose, the nostril. The middle image is the eyes. Then you have the brown part here being the hair of that particular woman. So that is the old woman. If we are talking about the young woman, I'll encircle the young part. Facing sideways is the young woman. So, the lower part, the mouth of the old woman becomes the choker or the necklace for the young woman. The nose of the old woman becomes the chin or the jaw of the young woman. Whereas the eyes of the old woman becomes the ears. Then you have this, still the hair for the young woman, then you have the feathers for the headdress for that particular woman. So it is dependent of how you look at that. Once you know what we have identified, it cannot be undone, it cannot be unseen already. If you are visually presented with that image, you will automatically say it's a young woman or it's an old woman, depending on how we have presented the image already. So I will flash to you very fast another image. What do you see in this picture? What do you think you see? Huh? What do you see? Blank? Map of the city. What else?
Tiger.
Huh?
Tiger.
Tiger, yes. What else? Fish. You may also say, how come I flash it in a very short manner? The reason why we flash that very fast is because it is like what we are doing in the laboratory and the workshop. We are going about in a very fast-paced manner. We do not go out and like strolling along the laboratory or the workshop doing things. You cannot easily gaze, you cannot easily identify. Take note that our eyes is constantly moving. So, unlike the eyes, for example, of the birds, where they can see a higher focus, any movement, Our eyes cannot. So if the bird wants to focus on something, what they will be doing is moving the entire head itself, because there is no movement of the eyeballs itself. Whereas for us, we can see the entire situation, for example, and then if we want to focus, if there is some interesting thing or aspect in the laboratory, then we focus or we zoom in with our eyes. Not necessarily moving our head, but moving our eyeballs. It is also the same thing there. If we are able to notice something is wrong, something is off in the laboratory, we focus and then we try to identify the hazard. So most of you identified different things in that particular image. One is almost correct, but it is not a tiger, but rather a leopard. So, in this picture that is being focused clearly, you will now see a leopard. So, if I go back to the original image, you cannot unsee the leopard, but rather your eyes will be drawn to the leopard immediately, because I introduced that there is a leopard there. If we bring this particular image back. So, similarly, the analogy for this is, if we educate ourselves with the different hazards in the workplace, what we will be doing is we can no longer unsee the hazard in our workplace or in the laboratory or in the workshop. If we are saying, especially for those laboratories with new trainees, if you introduce to the trainees or to the new staff that there is a heat hazard in 146, for example, the person or the new staff cannot unsee that particular hazard. Immediately, they will know that there is a heat hazard there, or there is a radiation hazard in physics. If we did not tell them, we or the new staff or the trainees will not know. But if they are observant, then maybe they will be able to notice and then focus on those particular hazards in the workplace. Another image is this one. Are you able to focus on the silhouettes in that particular environment? If we try to add more clarity to the image, you will notice that there are three animals there, but it is not a leopard, but rather the cheetah, found lying around, and probably you will notice already the surroundings itself. You can see immediately the animals and the immediate surroundings with no problem at all, as opposed to seeing that earlier. But if I flash the previous image, then you will notice immediately where those animals are and where the trees and the grasses are already. Because I introduced to you the concept that there are these organisms, the cheetahs, the three cheetahs, and the trees and the grasses that are found there. So, when we are trying to visualize, we are just talking about the time period, the use of the lines, use of geometric shapes or use of space, and of course, placement of the image. The visualization technique that I am talking about originated in the arts. So, for example, in this particular painting, if we are just talking about the time period, the use of lines, the geometric shapes, space, and placement of the image, you can clearly see what we are talking about. If you frequently watch, for example, the movies, you may likely see the vertical lines The horizontal lines, maybe this is relatively wet environment. The yellow taxis, the high buildings with billboards. If you are very frequently watching movies, I'm saying, you may connote a particular city or area or place where this is located. So initially, because I know about this already, I know that there are a lot of signages, but we can talk about, for example, Japan. But Japan does not have any yellow taxis. So the only one with cities like this with yellow taxis is New York, for example. So I will connote that this is New York. So that is how you try to visualize and interpret the image that we are seeing. So again, if we translate that to you visualizing, you making observation, for example, of a workplace. What do you see, for example, in this workshop? With the use of line, with the use of color, space, in identifying all the things that are here, when I introduce you what the colors connote earlier, what do you notice about this particular workshop? When you are observing the reality of your workplace, you have to observe what is close to you, and then you move away from what is close to you to further towards the end of the area. Then maybe you can start identifying the different colors that are found in the area. For example, there is an extensive use of yellow. So you have the lines, the yellow colored lines. You have the yellow lines, yellow color here with black lines. What does this connote? Is this a caution? Is this a warning? For example, you have some guardrails also. You have some guardrails that are found. What does this mean? What is the use for those? Then you have some yellow colored equipment. What is this? What is the potential hazard or what is the potential risk? Why do we use those color? Then we go to the different equipment, for example. You will notice, if you are familiar with equipment in your workshop or in your laboratory, there is a compressor. What is the type of work being done in that workshop? Why is there a compressor? Is there a noise hazard or noise risk for this? Are they using PPE in this particular area? Then if you move further away, you will notice that there is a drum. So likely they are using chemicals. Is there an SDS? Safety data sheet. Is the chemical they are using hazardous? So that is the problem, or what is the problem here? Then you may be seeing a lot of cupboards or cabinets for the different materials that they are using, tools, equipment that they are using. So what is the nature of their work? Are you noticing some housekeeping issues? Meaning, are things, materials cluttered? You have to account for all of these things. And then, those are some of the items that I noticed. Are you noticing, maybe it is not clear in this from your side, are you noticing a person working in the first place in the image? Anyone notice the person? So if it is not clear to you, from my side it is here. But the person that I'm noticing is just wearing ordinary clothing. Does it mean that his line of work or his type of the work does not need any proper or appropriate PPE? if he does not need the appropriate PPE, how come this particular machine, for example, is it properly guarded? How come he is not wearing the proper PPE, for example? Or is he an outsider just visiting that particular area? So those are the questions that you need to raise. Those are the observations that you need to do. So area by area, color by color, line by line, or space by space, you try to identify. That is also what you should be doing when you are in the laboratory. Once you enter, imagine, categorize what the things that needs to be done, or what are the different functions or use for all the different equipment that you have in your laboratory or in your workshop. So, if you try to look at health and safety through a safety lens, we may be experiencing some biases. We know that most of us are already working for several semesters or several years in the workshop or in the laboratory. So there might be some biases that we already have. For example, if you are asked, or if there is an audit, I asked you, there might be some apprehension on your part. If you are new to the laboratory, because maybe you want to emphasize on the existing hazards that are found there. So you may have some apprehension, or you have this apprehension because the risk or the hazards that you are raising frequently is not being addressed. Or we may talk about you becoming more accustomed already to the risk or to the hazards that you have in the laboratory in such a manner that maybe you do not notice the risk or the hazard anymore. And that is not a good thing, because if you do not notice the risk or the hazard while working because you are accustomed to the risk, then you may be constantly overlooking on the risk or the hazard itself in that particular area. Or we talked about subjectiveness. What you perceive as a risk or a hazard may not be a risk or a hazard to another person, depending on who is looking, who is inspecting, or who is observing in your workplace or laboratory. So you may be a user, there might be an inspector or the one auditing your laboratory or workshop. Or there might be an external auditor. For example, the admin management visiting the laboratories may see differently from what you are seeing that when you are actually working in that workplace, in that laboratory or workshop. Or us coming from the committee may be seeing differently from what you are seeing. So we may be pinpointing and you may be refuting that particular aspect. So how do we try to resolve that? So there are several steps. There are at least 6 ideal. When I say ideal, it is not necessarily that we are following this. For most of these recommendations or suggestions, we are just talking about the ideal way of trying to look health and safety through a clear lens. So for example, what do you do about step 1? When you are carrying out internal hazards and identifying these internal hazards, how do you do that? You try to document, you try to identify potential controls when you are identifying the hazards through work assessment. The next step, you have to make use of previous reports. That's the reason why we are documenting the laboratory maintenance, equipment maintenance reports, the accident reports, for example, we are having that. And of course, you can also make use of the internet for other data relevant to what you are working on. For example, incident accident reports for the Department of Applied Sciences or Pharmacy or Engineering compared to the actual incident rate or accident rate in Oman in the context of universities and colleges. Then, we already have this. We use a structured process. So it's a formal process where we try to more or less document the incidents or the accidents and more or less document the hazards. For those who are forgetting, we have a hazard reporting form that we can always use. If you are not using this, we can make use of the emailing your supervisor, emailing your HOS, or emailing the admin regarding the hazard that you may have identified in the laboratory or workshop. The other formal process for documenting this is the incident or accident reporting form. The next step, there is a focus inspection. We are usually conducting an audit of the area for each department. So for now, we are just focusing on closing out the audit of the previous year, but there were clear instructions to all coordinators wherein whatever is raised by the staff for those departments should also be incorporated in the closing out of the audit. The second to the last step is investigation. If there are any grave or significant incidents occurring in your workplace. The emphasis in this is we are trying to correct what happened. We are not running after the staff regarding the incident, because some have this psyche wherein if we are investigating a particular incident, we are gunning or we are blaming the staff. No, it is not. It is more or less focusing on trying to correct what has been wrong in what we are doing and at least avoid those mistakes in the future. And lastly, we will be talking about if we cannot do this ourselves, we try to seek the assistance. So for example, the assistance that we have been looking for would be outside, for example, with the IOSH, we try to collaborate, or we seek the assistance of the PACDA for our emergency evacuation process, because we are trying to improve that. So these are the things that we are trying to more or less do in the department or in the campus, but that I also want you to do. What we will be doing in the next two images, I will be handing it out to you so that at least you have some reference, is to try to do the first step, which is to identify the hazard. Because I said earlier, we don't have the time, so I will just give you an image, a reference image, and I will give you a hard copy for this for your reference also. Imagine this particular workshop, and we try to identify what would be the potential hazards you might be encountering here. This will be evidence, so I will just give you this. This is our activity. So workers are doing some activities in a warehouse. Are you able to identify at least 5 hazards that are found here? Are you able to pinpoint out? What you can do in that paper, is probably encircle the hazards that you are able to identify. I'll give you a minute or two, and then we will walk through all those hazards that we have identified, and maybe you can also pinpoint if I missed out anything in the picture. So if anyone wants to talk, the mic is here. Are you able to identify?
Something drop down on the floor.
Yeah.
So slippery is possible.
Okay, that's correct.
Here also she's coming out, and there is also
The pallet.
space.
Yeah.
And here also is coming and the way it is like this. It is also not in proper place working. And these are hazards. Huh?
Yeah. So that's very good. What about the others?
Is it an electrical point behind the
Okay.
And this door, if it opens, then it cannot be opened and it is not properly placed. Here some oil is spilling something,
Okay.
and here there is she cannot move. There is
So-
obstruction. Here electrical point, the door cannot be
Okay.
opened.
What about the others? Anyone? You want to talk? Anyone? This table?
How many observations I will tell? I will add. I observed that the chemicals are not properly labeled
Okay.
and not very hard hat. Not all are wearing laboratory coat
Or PPE?
PPE and carrying through the by hand and not using trolley. And also the place is nothing over there.
Okay.
A lot of culture, as you may say, elsewhere, and the door seems like for a dwarf person. and the stair like is slippery.
Okay.
These are some I observed.
So most of you pointed more or less the issue of housekeeping, the issue of a slipping and tripping hazard, and some of you, though not directly identifying it, also talked about the issue of ergonomics. Then most of you also talked about the issue of evacuation routes, though you have not clearly talked about that one, like this. It is clearly an evacuation route or route for entry and egress. And then some of you, which I did not identify, for example, the proper use of the PPE, I did not identify that here in the image. So that is also correct. So we will try to identify individually all the hazards that are found here in a counterclockwise manner. So for example, from the door, so here there is obstruction for the root. There is a container or materials here. The door is clearly obstructed also, so the railings that you were talking about, you may be right about it. It's also the same for this. It can be an obstruction. Then a housekeeping issue One of you pointed out that this might be a socket. It might also be correct, or it might be just for this material. Then there are several holes. So the floor is not well maintained. So it can be an issue of a tripping hazard also for the person here using the trolley, as pointed out. Then housekeeping issue, you have identified that, also this one. So obstruction and housekeeping issue. This one is an ergonomics issue. Why is that person not using the trolley like what we have here? So it's an ergonomics, so lifting of heavy materials. Then we are also talking about storage. This one, if you notice, it is in sacks. So it means that it might be heavy. The question or the issue here is, will the load or the capacity sufficient for the racks? Because if it's too heavy, you will see that these are relatively large loads. There is a potential for collapse for this material or for these racks. The other image that we have is this one. So again, we go back to, are you able to identify the hazards? The reason why we are doing workplaces that are not the laboratory or the workshops, because it is more apparent in this area or in these types of workplaces, but these are also applicable in the laboratory or the workshop. I have not been able to find, honestly, a better image. I also don't want to take pictures of our workshop or laboratory for us to criticize. So it's better that we have an ideal image of other workplaces. So again, I'll give you a minute or two, and then we will go together, because we don't have the time, of the different hazards that I identify. Again, if you have any additional inputs, like what some of you have already pointed out, for example, the use of PPE, then it's much better. Again, 1 or 2 minutes. The hazards identified here is more or less similar to the one in the previous image. You want to talk?
A person standing below basically, the driver cannot see that person.
Okay, the one near the backhoe.
Yes.
Okay,
And the free wire is going here.
okay.
Electrical wire.
So there's electrical wire, tripping hazard. What else?
And these two persons, they are not looking at the work at all.
Okay,
They are looking at somewhere.
okay.
Here, this person is not standing and supporting his
Yeah, okay, there's no guard. So those are also correct. Anyone else? Anybody? John? Dr. John? The lady and the child below to your lower right, okay. Are they part of the construction site? So they are basically outsiders. So there's no guarding to keep out those that are not involved in the activity. So what else?
I am actually looking at things that are not there. For example, the safety cabinet like that or a station.
Okay.
A station for an accident. Where
Okay.
we can do some first aid like that.
Okay. So those, the one Dr. John is talking about those are beyond the image already. But if you are taking exams, you should only account for those that are in the image. You should not be talking about those that are being implied not to be in the image. Otherwise, you will fail the exam, especially for certification in health and safety. You are asked only this, you should only give those that are here. So again, we will try to identify in a clockwise manner, sorry. Let's see if it's working. So there is an issue of scaffolding that you have talked about. This one, so there is no guardrail for that person, so there is a falling hazard. Then, why is this a heavy pallet of materials? It's also a falling hazard. Then, the platform where the scaffolding is standing. You will notice that the other platform here are more or less in a stable soil, but this one you will notice it's uneven or it's not properly placed. Correct about the outsiders, they don't have any business there. How come they are nearby a hazard site? You also talked about this person kind of distracted. That's also correct. Those are additional observations. But I was talking about this. How come this machine is not guarded? So there should be guarding here. It's also the same tripping hazard for the electrical wire that you have pointed out. Then you have this person working on an area that should not be a workplace because these are the wood pallets that they are being cut. How come he is working there? And then the PPE that you are talking about. This one is jackhammering a trench. And take note that he is jackhammering at the same time this is in danger of collapse for this particular area. You talked about ergonomics and housekeeping issue. If you are talking about the person carrying a heavy block, you will be wondering, like what Dr. Jens is beyond the image, how were they able to transport these materials? Are we talking about through carrying? Because I don't see any pulley here for lifting the blocks up in the scaffolding. And of course, you have the person at the bottom of the backhoe shouting. He is shouting instructions to this, but he is also in danger of being run over by this or any falling material coming from this material. And of course, the issue of the ladder, you will notice that the ladder is just in place without any hooks to put it in place for the ladder itself. So we have identified the hazards. What do we do with them once we have identified the hazards? We talked about controlling these hazards, trying to more or less put it at a minimum by putting up some measures. Usually in health and safety, we are talking about hierarchy of controls in the form of this inverted triangle. So elimination, most of the time, is impossible. So what we do is try substituting, putting some engineering controls, like the guarding that I'm talking about. For the engineering people here, most of your equipment, especially in the mechanical, I think, and some in the electrical, are not guarded. So some of the blades that I am seeing in some of your equipment are exposed. So there is a potential for injury for the users. So this falls under the engineering control. Administrative control, change how we work by changing the culture that we have. Meaning, we don't have an engagement for some department of reporting incidents or accidents. We change that by training, toolbox talks, and similar activities like this, for example, to encourage us reporting and more or less to change the workplace culture into a more proactive one. And of course, the last one, which is not the most effective or the least effective, is PPE. Most of us are using this, and most of us are using PPE in combination of administrative engineering controls. Elimination and substitution, not much is being done, but we are trying to. We are already doing what we can, for example, for those sections in engineering and applied sciences and probably pharmacy using chemicals. We try to substitute the most toxic chemicals with some alternatives that are available in the market. Take note that there are a number of chemicals that we still have in our stores that are already prohibited by other countries. So we try to substitute that because they are causing cancer, for example, or other illnesses in among the workers or the staff. So with this regard, we talked about what do we look for in a laboratory or workshop. In this particular image, I am just presenting or emphasizing some of the things that we need to check, but are they sufficient? What is lacking? These are just one aspect of the holistic way of trying to identify the hazards and correspondingly trying to see or solve the risk or the hazards through control measures. One of the things that we are doing is this. You can easily see that, you can easily visualize this. This was the content of what we have discussed earlier. However, it is only one part. If you want to make it more comprehensive, you have to define how you are identifying the hazards into different categories. In Lean principle, what we are usually doing is divide that into 4 categories. The 4 categories that we are talking about, which is outside of this, meaning this is just one scope, this is just one category, are the 4M. Are you familiar with Lean principle, the Kaizen principle? The 4M, machine, man, method, materials. There are some proponents of putting others. Anything that you cannot categorize into the 4M would be categorized into the other section. What we usually do is when we talk about man, we are talking about the organization, the skill, the talent of that particular individual, the how man or how the staff communicate, and the resources that the staff can use to prevent or to limit that hazard. When we talk about the machine, we are talking about how is the machine designed, how is it installed in your workplace, and were there sufficient information coming from the supplier. When we talk about the method, simply from the term, we are talking about the procedure or protocol. And of course, most of the things that you saw in the previous slide would come under the material, the design, the quality of those infrastructure that are placed or installed there. Others, for example, that within the 4M, we are talking about installation, we are talking about materials, we are talking about methods for training. So we may require budget or money for this, which are not found under the 4M. What we usually do when we categorize is we try to more or less place that in a fishbowl diagram or the Ishikawa diagram. I don't know if you are familiar with this. It is a diagram that more or less shows a causal or the causes of that particular event. This one is that you have a particular goal or you have a particular objective in mind, and you identify by writing the 4M here in the blue area: man, method, machine, and material, and then probably identify the different causes, the different problems that is attributed to those specific 4Ms, and of course the others. With this particular type in mind, you may be able to flesh out the potential control measures because you were able to root out the problem from the beginning. For example, you try to solve one hazard or you try to solve one problem in your workplace. For example, let's go to the engineering. So, an electrical overstress. When we talk about electrical overstress, it is just the failure of your devices because most of your instruments or equipment is subjected to fluctuating voltages, likely because you are using it from 8 to 8, for example, for your equipment. So, if you try to identify the 4M, man, materials, methods, and machine, these are some of the potential causes and the root causes why you are causing this particular hazard or risk for your equipment. For example, man is the person operating the equipment trained from the beginning. Is he exposed? Does he know how to use the equipment? That is one. So if he does not know, that engineer or that particular staff is incompetent to use. I'm not talking about incompetence in general, but I'm talking about incompetence with the use of the equipment. So do not generalize. Probably I do not have the experience to use that particular equipment, so I don't have that, so I require training. So lack of training. Then probably lack of experience or motivation. For materials, are we talking about the different spare parts available for that material? Because based on the methods that we have for that particular material, it required that there is what? Frequent maintenance. But because there is no frequent maintenance, it's here. Preventive maintenance or calibration, because of general lack of supplies, then likely it is also a cause for the electrical overstress of that particular equipment or machine. Here, for the machine itself, is it properly designed? Is the hardware the appropriate hardware that you should be using for that particular practical or experiment that you are using? Likely, you are having a practical activity that is not appropriate for that particular machine, but maybe because of your lack of knowledge for that particular machine, you still insisted to use that particular equipment or machine. So, it causes the electrical overstress. Or, the method, the protocol that is being used for that particular equipment, are you following it? Are you to the end of all the specific instructions that is being given there? So, are you doing it? Are you following it? Based on the software, based on the instructions given in the material, in the SOP or the manual for this particular machine. So these are the things that you need to account for. It is not just one aspect like in the previous 2 slides wherein if we talked about this particular laboratory or workshop, we try to see only the infrastructural aspect. You have to account man and method. Some of us, some departments are accounting for man, but they are not accounting for the machine or the materials being used. So, when you are going to the laboratory, because this is also what we are emphasizing, what we are doing is a holistic way of seeing your laboratory or workshop already. Try to understand when you walk into the door of a laboratory or workshop, segment by segment, according to the colors, especially for some laboratories where it is properly organized, according to the flow or direction of the equipment or the materials found, or according to the layout, according to the different signages or colors that you see. And then, based on that, according to the 4 M's, what is the potential risk or hazard that you are seeing? Others are others are easily observed, but the others may not be observable because you have to account for the rest of the 4 M's, for the 4 M's itself. Because what you are seeing, which are readily observable, are basically the infrastructural aspect only. So that ends the presentation or the pseudo workshop that we have. Are there any questions? Hopefully, I have imparted some of the basic concepts of what should be done by emphasizing on the visual aspect of your laboratory or workshop. The other topics or the other topics that we have covered, it is of a different activity because more or less it is comprehensive and it requires another set of time. For example, we just mentioned some of the processes, hazard identification, which is also part of risk assessment and risk management, which we did not cover for this particular presentation. So, any questions, points of clarifications, violent reactions? Take note, I was told that you have to have a feedback for you to be able to obtain your attendance certificate. And if you want to talk about it, let's talk about it related to risk, health, and safety. You can always email the Risk, Health, and Safety Committee with the email address of rhs@hct.edu.om if you want some clarification, and we are always readily available. So with that, thank you for coming and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone, to attend this session. Actually, a lot of informative session today about risk and health. We needed actually, and a lot of topics will come.